One country seemingly on the cusp of civil war, one country firmly in the midst of it. What holds next for Egypt and Syria? Let's find out from Kamran Bokhari, Vice President, Middle Eastern and South Asian Affairs for Stratfor, and he's also doing, we should say, his PhD at the University of Westminster in London, UK, on democracy and Islam. And it's good to see you back here in these parts.
Always glad to be here.
So you were overseas until just recently, I guess.
I flew in last Friday.
Okay, good to see you again. Let's start with Egypt. The clashes that we are seeing right now between the supporters of and the opponents of President Morsi looks quite tense. Do you want to bring our audience up to date on what has triggered this latest outbreak?
Well, for starters, I don't think it's going to be a civil war because then you run into a problem. So if Syria is civil war, then what's happening in Egypt, clearly it's not the same magnitude. So we need to come up with some sort of other definition for it. I think there's a lot of unrest. It's been triggered by a key event, and the key event was that President Morsi decreed himself extraordinary special powers that sort of made him immune from legislative. Well, there is no legislature, so he is the legislature, and he, basically set himself immune from judicial review. Why did he do that? Because he wants to see the constitutional process move forward, where there is a constitution, and the Muslim Brotherhood, his organization, or former organization, if we are to use that word, because once with the Brotherhood, you're always with the Brotherhood. So they want to see parliamentary elections. That process can't take place until there is a constitution. And the judiciary has a lot of cases pending that could throw out the Constituent Assembly. So he needed to make sure that his goal was to get to the Constitution and then to parliamentary elections. The problem is that it triggered a backlash from people who had supported him in the ouster of Mubarak.
What kind of people, demographically? Who are they?
The demographically, we come up with all sorts of terms like liberal, secular. Well, let's just use the word non-Islamist. Okay. And the non-Islamist, and these are they're not a coherent lot, far from it actually. They're a coalition of people who have disagreements amongst themselves. So you have, former foreign minister of Mubarak, Amr Musa, who ran for, the presidency himself, but didn't win in the first round. You have Hamdeen Sabahi, who's the leader of a Nasserite trend, a leftist from the old days. You have Mohamed al-Baradei, who used to head the UN nuclear watchdog, yeah. and he's a secular politician now. And then you have a litany of youth groups that triggered the uprising back in early 2011, which led to Mubarak's ouster.
Now, the only thing they have in common is that they don't want Sharia law and Islamism to rule.
Well, it's much more complicated because the Brotherhood hasn't done much in the way of Sharia law, and it's definitely different than the Salafists, who are far more right of center than the Brotherhood. But what the problem is that the Brotherhood is the single largest party. It demonstrated that both in the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections, and these people somehow need to contain the rise of the Brotherhood. The youth are bitter that they're the ones who started everything that got rid of Mubarak, and here comes the Brotherhood and benefited from that process.
Well, this does raise the question. Do you think Morsi is doing many of the same things that Mubarak did, which ended up getting him turfed from office?
I don't think he's doing exactly what Mubarak was doing. There's a world of difference, but he's having to do some of what Mubarak was doing, and then there's sort of the whole idea that well, I'm trying to save democracy by bending the rules of democracy.
Well, you say he's having to do it. He's choosing to do it.
He's choosing to do it, but from his point of view, if you look at his geopolitical goal, his goal is to get from where we are right now to a new constitution and then to parliamentary elections.
And you have no doubt that he'll relinquish these powers once that process is completed?
I don't see him keeping it up because it'll only undermine him further. He already has a fire on his hand. So if he does that, then he makes matters worse for himself.
Do you see a compromise in the offing here?
I think there is a compromise. In fact, just as I was coming in, there was a flash on Reuters that President President Morsi has said that as long as there are guarantees that the judiciary will not torpedo the constitutional process, I am willing to delay the constitutional referendum. And then some elements of the opposition announced that they are willing to negotiate and go to the meeting that is supposed to be held tomorrow at 12:30 at the presidency. Earlier, the opposition came out with a unified saying, no, that we're not going to engage in this dialogue until Morsi gives, concedes some ground.
Which he has done.
Partially.
Partially. Okay. If that's considered progress, do you want to send them to Washington next and have them work on the fiscal cliff, or is that another? Never mind, we'll move on.
I don't get into areas that are not my area of expertise.
I understand. The Mubarak was considered to be deeply in trouble when the military turned on him. Is that the case for Morsi here? Do you expect the military to turn on him as well?
That is the key question in this entire crisis. What is the military trying to achieve? It is complicated. On one hand, they need a new civilian partner. And it does seem, with the way that, if you look at the constitutional draft, the military pretty much got everything that they wanted, special privileges and whatnot. And so it does seem like there's some sort of a Muslim Brotherhood military sort of alignment in the making. At the same time, the military cannot just simply become a partner with the MB, because this is not Mubarak's NDP. This is a very ambitious movement that ultimately wants to defang the military. And therefore, the military has to have options. So this whole ruckus or drama that's taking place serves the military's interest perfectly. On one hand, they don't want to see Morsi going down, definitely don't want to see the presidency becoming a joke, if you will. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they want to have enough counters, enough levers against Morsi and the Brotherhood. And so they're playing both sides off.
We've talked about the military as if it is a single thinking, unified institution. Is it?
For the most part, it is. When we talk about any military in any country, we're talking about the leadership and the chain of command. And as far as we can tell, the military is pretty cohesive. Are there sort of voices of dissent? Sure, there always are.
There always are, yeah.
But it hasn't reached the level where the military is losing its coherence as an institution.
Do you look at President Morsi as the president of all Egyptians or just the Islamists?
He is the president of mostly the Islamists, and then those people who said he is the lesser of two evils. On one hand, they had Shafiq in the second round, former Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, the Air Force guy, Mubarak's right hand for a very long time. They didn't want the old people coming back in. They wanted to throw them out. The only way to do that was to vote for Morsi. So I really don't like you, but you know what? You're still better than the other.
Less worse.
Less worse. Now, the problem is that now that's over with, and those disagreements and tensions come out. And therefore, he got only 51.7% of the vote in the second round and defeated the other guy.
Not even as good as Obama.
Well, of course, we can make those comparisons. But what does that mean? That means that Morsi is the president of half the country from a legitimacy or a mandate point of view. Mm-hmm. So what he needs is, to rope in others in order to be able to rule.
And you're, obviously this isn't Syria yet, but you feel quite confident based on your experience of watching the region that this is not going to turn into civil war. Have I got that right?
Yes, and the reason why I say that is because Egypt is its military. It has been since the 52 revolution or coup that ousted the monarchy. And it's been the mainstay and the foundation and the core of the system and the country. Contrast that with Syria. Bashar al-Assad has turned into one of the many warlords of that country. He is no longer a state actor. He is a non-state actor. Of course, he is the most powerful non-state actor still, but that's a world of a difference between what's in Egypt and what's in Syria.
Okay, since you have nicely turned the corner for us, let's move on and talk Syria now. President Obama called Assad's use of chemical weapons a red line. He has warned of, quote, enormous consequences if President Assad decides to deploy chemical weapons. Why is this coming up now?
It's coming up right now because the United States needs to, break the stalemate, doesn't want to let this whole civil war that's going on drag on for a long time. And it could drag on because Assad is the most powerful non-state actor, but his forces are much better equipped than the rebels. They have much more cohesion than the rebels. The rebels are all over the place, between those who sympathize with al-Qaeda to the very few who are liberal, and most of the others are Islamists. This is not really a comfortable alliance for Washington. And what Washington wants to see is Bashar's generals basically giving him the boot and cutting a deal with the opposition. And so you can have a power sharing agreement. In other words, regime change, but continuity of state machinery.
Is that possible?
It's a tall order, because the people who are with Bashar and toughed it out and have still remained with him are there for a reason. They are mostly Alawites who command the military, dominate the military leadership.
And who are what percent of the population?
They're about 10 to 15%. The estimates are all over the place.
Okay.
We'll use 10 to 15 for our purposes. They see that, after 4 or 5 decades of being in power, they are going to be really vulnerable. They're going to turn into a political minority under any negotiated settlement. And more importantly, they are setting themselves up for a possible, vengeance attacks. So they could be the subject of, a massacre, if you will. And so it's not just political privileges, economic privileges, it is physical survival for them.
Okay, but up until now, the administration has been watching this and obviously trying to avoid a bloodbath in the massacre. Nobody likes the fact that tens of thousands of people have been killed. But until very recently, nobody has been warning Assad against using chemical weapons. What makes them think that option is suddenly on the table now?
It's not on the table. We assume that all geopolitical actors are rational actors. If you are President Assad, you are already under a lot of heat. You do not want to use chemical weapons to make life more miserable, especially when you are floating the idea that, I'm looking at asylum, so what can you give me? You can't ask for asylum from the international community and use chemical weapons against your own people.
Do you know for a fact that he's doing that?
There are all sorts of reports that are being floated.
Reports or rumors?
They're not rumors, they're reports. And we have, at Stratfor, we have our sources who are confirming the same thing.
Okay, tell me what your sources are saying about whether or not there are caches of chemical weapons that are somehow being moved, I'm going to use an analogy here, from the basement to the main floor, because he does have some hankering to use them.
He absolutely has the stockpiles, but the question is he using them or is he posturing? Okay, you look at North Korea, the previous leader, and the current leader both have demonstrated that, they can wave the nuclear card, the missile card, and say, look, we're crazy, we're going to do this, to gain attention, to get the other side to negotiate. That's exactly what, I think is happening in Syria.
So you see no circumstances under which Syria would use its
unless
chemical
they're
weapons?
ready to commit geopolitical suicide. I just don't see them doing that. The other thing over here is that you have to understand, I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if this was a deliberate move to gain the attention of the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. satellites, saying, okay, let's move these because they're not getting a deal. They're not getting the kind of deal that they want. They also want, a way out of this crisis.
So they're upping the ante a bit.
They're upping the ante a bit. This is brinksmanship. This is posturing. I seriously doubt that they're going to use that, because if they use that, then they're worse off than they are right now.
Well, I was just going to say, if no chemical weapons are deployed, presumably that also means NATO doesn't get involved. Is that right?
NATO doesn't want to get involved. I mean, if we look at what has happened in Libya, if we look at the way the United States and its NATO allies have dealt with Syria, amidst very heavy criticism that they're allowing, tens of thousands of people getting killed or wounded, we see that they're saying, Turkey, you take care of it. This is your problem. It's on your border. And so if we know that, then there's no way the United States is eager to get involved. What the United States is doing is rattling the chain of the generals of Bashar, President Bashar al-Assad, and saying, you have a choice. It's telling them, well, we may be coming in, so you still have time to choose a side. So it's shaping perceptions, just as the regime is shaping perceptions with these sort of, moves that suggest that they're going to use. The United States, through these leaks, is also shaping perceptions.
But let's say, not that you ever are, but let's say you're wrong about this, and let's say Syria does deploy chemical weapons. The international outrage would be so intense, NATO would have to get involved.
NATO will have to get involved. And the Russians and the Iranians have warned them not to do it. The Russians actually did it publicly. The Iranians are doing it privately because ultimately the Iranians and the Russians are at a point where they are ready to throw Bashar under the bus, given the right circumstances and for the right price, but they want the regime intact, as much of it as possible.
Do you know whether or not top American officials have been in touch with elements of the opposition with whom they presumably have links to outlay a potential post-Assad Syrian vision for running the country?
Absolutely.
What does that look like?
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has been involved in this heavily. The problem is that you've got too many actors. You've got the opposition has too many factions. They recently came up with a new alliance, which was created in Qatar, and they're trying to proceed from there. But the bottom line is that this is a fragmented, divided opposition. There are people outside with the offices and the business cards and all of that and the clout, at least in the media.
Right.
And there are those who are fighting on the ground. And so they're not necessarily the same people.
This is so evocative of Iraq, isn't it, in some respects? Got the people on the ground doing the fighting who are the people who you should be talking to, but it's the folks who've got the offices in London who seem to have the ear of the Pentagon.
I would argue that in Iraq, it was far more cohesive. The people who were relocated from London to Iraq, and at that point in time, the United States and Iran were heavily negotiating behind the scenes for the future makeup of Iraq. And I would argue, if you go back to Ahmed Shalabi and all those ayatollahs that were being courted by the Pentagon and the Bush administration at that time, it was very clear that it was much more easier. This is going to make Iraq, look like a
kindergarten.
I'm sorry to say that.
We got a few minutes left, and let's just broaden our look and look at some of the other countries in the neighborhood. All of what's going on in Syria, all of what's going on in Egypt. What kind of an impact is that having on other regional powers such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran?
Okay, let's start from Turkey. Turkey sees a fire burning on its southern flank. It is a complex fire. Why? Because a regime is in meltdown mode. It's on their border, entire southern flank, much of it.
So the notion of immigrants fleeing across the border is huge.
They can't have their perfect order next to a chaotic, place. So that's to begin with. Number two, there are all sorts of, undesirable elements like al-Qaeda and other Islamist militants that the Turks don't want to have to deal with. Number three, and most importantly, there are Kurds.
Right.
And that is a huge red line for the Turks.
Which does not want to lose land to a potential Kurdistan.
Absolutely. They have a Kurdistan in Iraq. There will be some Kurdistan in the future in Syria. And that puts all the more pressure on the Turks to accommodate their own Kurds, which are far more in number than either Turkey or in Syria.
Okay, 2 minutes left. Let's make sure we get Saudi Arabia and Iran. How about the Saudis?
The Saudis are looking at this and saying, well, you know what? If Syria goes down, we can get Sunni empowerment of some sorts. That helps us with Iran. We punch a hole in the Iranian sphere of influence. But at the end of the day, the Saudis have a lot more problems on their hands. They have a geriatric leadership that is essentially, on its way out. If this king, who is not doing well, not if, but when he passes away, the crown prince takes over as king. The question is, who becomes crown prince? There are not too many sons left. King Abdullah doesn't have too many brothers left, able brothers, to take over, which means that you go into the grandsons. And they number too many. And the old way of doing business, where you huddle together and say, well, let's decide on the new king or the new crown prince, doesn't work anymore. So you have to come up with a much more complex mechanism, far more rivalry, competition. That's Saudi Arabia's main worry at home.
Iran
is looking at this and saying, we wish this wouldn't have happened to Syria. If the Arab Spring hadn't reached Syria, it would have been better. Now it has. We can't do anything about it. But we still have some options. If we can't have Syria, we will not allow anyone else to have Syria, or at least we'll try not to allow others to have Syria. How do you do that? You continue to support the regime and hope that the other side, and especially the United States, will cut a deal. If that doesn't happen, and this regime actually falls, then you fuel an insurgency. So you can have regime collapse, but you prevent the rise of a Sunni-dominated alternative government in Syria. That's what the Iranians are looking at.
Around the Middle East in 19.5 minutes. Kamran Bokhari, you've done it again. Thanks so much for visiting us here today at TVO.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.